Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. As accounts payable or vendor team members, we know that fraud risk is high in email. The question is there a way that you can tell which email addresses are risky, and is that sufficient to manage fraud risk? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 364. Question from a vendor process team member. What are the best ways to verify email addresses? Now, we know we are coming up to year end, and we know that fraud will increase because fraudsters know that we're dealing with increased volumes, lots of emails, lots of invoices, lots of vendors that need to be set up so those invoices can be posted and paid for the year, probably invoices that have been on internal team members' desks all year round. Plus, the expectation with security awareness training is that individuals are supposed to always catch fraud 100% of the time. So not only are we dealing with increased volumes, increased emails, increased fraudulent activity, but the expectation is we are supposed to know, or you are supposed to know, right, that with your security awareness training, that specific email addresses or emails are fraudulent and other ones are fine. And we're supposed to catch that, or you're supposed to catch that 100% of the time. Now, let's get into the question and then my response to her question, and then I'll talk about why it helps, but it has not helped to avoid more payment fraud. And I'm specifically talking about security awareness training. And many of you have probably heard me talk about this before, so you probably know what my answer is, but I'll give that. And then I will give my recommendation of really what should be done. So let's jump into the actual question. So the question came in, and it said, with email fraud being such a high risk, what are the best ways to verify emails, especially when many are generic domains like Gmail? Are there companies that verify emails like they do an address or phone number? Now, my response is always, thanks for reaching out. And then I said, there are companies like, and I gave the name of a company that can verify an email address for organization. And there are companies out there that can do that. But anyone, including a fraudster, can create a fake domain and use that to create a company email that will pass this verification. These types of services are really only useful for verifying that a team member or vendor point of contact is still employed at the company. If not, the service will tell you the email is not valid. For free accounts, they are never going to say that this is from a fraudster, but another is not. There are services that will tell you the email domain registration date, and recent dates could be a red flag. Also, there are services that will tell you if there has been fraudulent content reported on the site. Google has one, and you can search for it. The bad news is that you can't manage fraud risk by asking if the email address is fraudulent or not. Just assume every request to add and especially change vendor information is fraudulent and go from there. So, okay, my go from there, I'll talk about in a moment when I talk about recommendations of what to do. But I'm not surprised that I never heard back from this person because the expectation is there's supposed to be an answer for that, right? A resolution to that. And really, it's not. I mean, if you look at the free, especially when you're talking about the free emails, you can make one in like seconds and send it. And unfortunately, a lot of our vendors in that first tax classification on the W-9, the individual sole proprietor, also includes single member LLCs, right? A lot of them will use free email accounts like Jane's Roses at gmail.com or Jane's Flower Shop. We'll put it like that. Jane's Flower Shop at gmail.com because they don't want to pay, right, for a separate domain. And so they just use the Gmail account. Or even if they do, maybe, it came with a, set of, a limited number of email addresses. And so as you get more employees, they just use a Gmail account or, something to that effect. Or it could just be that it's fraudulent, right? But how are you supposed to know whether it is or not? Now, if there are tools out there that will do that, that is something that you might want to check with your IT teams to see if they have any suggestions. And on that note, from your IT teams, I've seen a couple of different reports that says that their tools that they're currently using, right, to filter these fraudulent emails, reports say that they can do that fairly well at 85%. Like they can stop about 85% of your fraudulent emails. And if you're dealing with Outlook, according to Microsoft Defender at one point, they said that about 78% of emails, fraudulent emails, can be prevented from getting into your inbox, meaning that 22% will get through. So no matter what you're using, anywhere from 15 to 22% of fraudulent emails do get through to your inbox. And so this was actually a really good question. However, I know that my answer really didn't satisfy because I know we're type A personalities and we just want a solution. And the problem is that there really isn't any because fraudsters are always evolving and there is no 100% way to identify, right, that an email address is not coming from a fraudster. And a couple of reasons why. Number one, the fraudsters are creating these email addresses fairly quickly now. They are creating domains, they're creating the collateral, meaning the websites, and everything else that goes with it fairly quickly than they used to in the past because of Gen AI. And so it doesn't even take that long to create them. Not to mention the fact that nowadays with phishing being so successful and with data breaches, every day we hear about another one. And so if the fraudster is not able to get the actual login credentials for emails, either by using phishing campaigns or by just going out and buying them on the dark web, uh, and unfortunately, a lot of vendors, internal team members of yours, hopefully not you, are reusing their login credentials across multiple platforms. And so, because of that, fraudsters are really in your vendors' emails, they are in your internal team members' emails. And so, they really don't have to, right, use a fraudulent email that you can look up somewhere using a tool and verify whether or not it's a fraud risk or whether or not it's a fraudulent email. And so I don't think that's the right question to ask, because I don't think that relying on team members to recognize a fraudulent email 100% of the time is ever a good strategy. I don't think it's ever going to work. So I know that cybersecurity awareness training is needed. I still think it's needed, but I don't think it goes far enough because it doesn't have additional steps if you can't tell that the email is fraudulent. If you can't tell that the email is valid, but it's a fraudster coming from your, legitimate vendor's email inbox or your legitimate team member's inbox. And so, yes, I think cybersecurity awareness training is required. I just don't think it goes far enough for the AP and the vendor team that have responsibility over securing payment remittance information, because again, it is hard to tell whether or not these emails that we receive are legitimate or not. And so, what is then the solution? And so, where I talked about, right, the bad news is that you can't manage fraud risk. Just assume that every request to add and especially change vendor information is fraudulent and go from there. What is the go from there? So I have a couple of things that I've learned from practitioners like you. One of them, and let me just state that these are two things that you can do for every email that comes in, and then the larger process really gets you out of email. So in case you can't tell or couldn't tell that that email was fraudulent, then you have other uh, processes in place or other steps that will catch the fraud. So, starting with, looking at the email or focusing on the email, I actually have three things. The first one is when you get that email in, check that email against if you have an email address on file, check it against that email address that you have on file. Now, when I say check it against the email address you have on file, I mean, don't just look at it. And again, this is something I got from a practitioner. And so there's a formula that you can do in Excel or Google Docs, right, to say if this cell matches this other cell, right? Whatever the values you have in both cells, if they match, then, you could have it say great, okay, or whatever you want it to have it say. And the same thing is if it does not match. And so this manager had that formula, and the team members then, when they got emails for vendor ads or changes, they were supposed to copy and paste the email from the email request, right? The email address from that request, put it in one of the cells, and then go into the vendor master file and grab the email address from that vendor master file. Now, if the email address was not the same person, then they would just grab the email domain, right? Everything after the at. And they would put both values right in each one in each of the cells that they were comparing. And then that way you can check to see if there's a spoof letter that you didn't see, right? Because maybe they're using a lowercase l instead of or a uppercase I instead of a lowercase l, or R and an N for an M, or two V's for a W. And so that's one thing that you can do. But I will tell you that when that manager told me about that step that they were putting in place, they said that the biggest issue they have is that a lot of the team members wouldn't always do it. So there you go with that. Now, the next one was this is something that has been a best practice for a while. I think the FBI came out with it over a decade ago. I mean, it's been a while, but not a lot of people talk about it. So if you haven't heard about it, that could be why. And the thing is if you receive an email and you have to reply to it, or maybe you want to reply to it with some authentication, right? Asking them authenticating questions, then you can start a whole new email string. But instead of copying and pasting the email address from the original email request you had, go to the vendor master file and copy the email address from the vendor record, and then use that and paste it into the email string. And then that way it actually goes to someone's email address that you actually had on file. Now, both of those require that you actually have an email address on file. And we know that that doesn't always happen. So that is one reason why, again, you need additional steps where if you don't recognize within the email that it is a fraudulent email for whatever reason, maybe they're coming from the vendor's actual email address, maybe, that the formula wasn't used, and so now the request has started to be processed. And this is where you, again, just assume that every request to add and especially change vendor information is fraudulent, and go from there. And how you go from there, I think, is actually the real question that should be asked, because I think a lot of these fraudulent emails, no one will be able to tell that they're fraudulent. I forgot to mention the fact that, a lot of them most of them don't include the spelling errors anymore, right? Because they have their own LLMs, large language models like ChatGPT, except they're using things like Worm GPT, Fraud GPT, Ghost GPT, right? So you won't have those telltale signs. So just assume every request to add and especially change vendor information is fraudulent, and then go from there. Now, what I mean by go from there is you should have authentication techniques where you're going to identify that the person you're receiving the inquiry from or the documents from is actually who they say they are. So it's asking those authenticating, identifying questions, and then also authenticating the data. So on the forms that you collect, and make sure they are your forms, because on those forms you can ask for existing vendor data or your internal team member that they have a relationship with. And yes, I know they can go to LinkedIn and get any internal team or get a team member that works for your company, but they don't know, right, if you're going to contact them or not. So it is an obstacle that will hopefully send them to the next potential victims, not asking those types of questions. So add that authenticating data on your forms. If they are asking to change banking, ask for the existing banking. Same thing with contact information. Same thing with the tax ID and with the address, because they're not just after banking details. details, right, for your ACH payments to vendors. They're also after check payments to vendors as well. So make sure you're asking some authenticating data, one, as an obstacle to the vendors or to the fraudsters, and then two, so you can make sure you are, right, receiving that information from who you think you're receiving it from. And then have some additional, right, internal controls beyond the validations. And I know a lot of you do have bank account ownership validation. Just keep in mind that the fraudsters can open up bank accounts using your vendors' names, their tax IDs, and their addresses as well, because some of your vendors have all of that or all three of those data points on their website, or it can be easily obtained. And so, bank account ownership validation using those three data points is no longer good enough. And I meant to mention, I'll put a link in the description that there is a webinar coming up. Actually, by the time this posts, it will have been the day before, but you can definitely watch the recording, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And so those internal controls can be things like making sure you are doing that confirmation call, not just one, but I recommend that you do two. You do it before the payment, but not just do it before the payment. Make sure that you are avoiding, right, some of the issues with making that confirmation call that can make it invalid. I'm going to put a link to 5 things that I see that are being done wrong with the confirmation calls, right? And how you can resolve those. And then once the payment goes out the door, do a confirmation call to make sure they received it. As a matter of fact, if you can only do one confirmation call, that's the one I would really do, because if it is a fraudulent request, you can contact the vendor when they should have received the payment. So same day ACH wire, you can call them that day, 48 hours for a regular ACH, and within 7 days for a check payment. And then that way, if it is a fraudulent or was a fraudulent request, now you have identified that the vendor has not received the request, has not received the payment. They've let you know they didn't make a change to their remittance information, right? And so now you can be within the bank's threshold of recovering the funds, because you haven't waited for the vendor to tell you that they haven't received the funds, which could be, right, days, weeks, maybe even months later. And by that time, it's outside of the bank's threshold to collect the funds, and you have not a good chance of getting those funds back. But if you call them within that time frame of when they should have received it, if it was a fraudulent request, now you have a great chance of getting recovering those funds. And so those are the types of things, definitely not all, but those are the types of things that you need to put into place so that you can prevent that fraudulent payment, even if you or your team does not recognize that the fraudulent email is a fraudulent email, right? And it's getting harder and harder to recognize that, because the fraudsters know what we're looking for. They also know that we're making that confirmation call too. And so you need to make sure that you have some processes in place, right? That even if that confirmation call seems like it's valid, that you have other processes in place that will catch that fraud, like calling the vendor after and making sure that they receive the payment. And one of the things I forgot to mention too is, because I talked about calling the vendor, when you are looking at, contacting the vendor for that confirmation call, make sure that they have not had their vendor record updated with contact information. because I didn't mention, on at least not on this podcast, but if you listen to other episodes, you've heard me say that one of the new fraud trends is for the fraudster to request a change in uh, contact information first and then submit a change to the banking or to the remittance address, because when that confirmation call is made, it's going to be made to the fraudster instead of to the actual vendor. So before you make a change or contact the vendor when you receive a request for a change, take a look at the contact information and make sure that wasn't updated recently. Uh, there are other things definitely that you can do to avoid payment fraud I should say, if you don't identify that the email is fraudulent. And all of these things that I just talked about came from my vendor process framework called Authentication Validation Management. It has 5 authentication techniques, 29 internal controls, 17 best practices, and 18 vendor validations. And what you really should be doing is looking at your process, your vendor process from end to end, and plugging up all the gaps that can lead to fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. And so in the show notes, I will add a link to the training session that I have, the workshop that I have on that framework. And I'm also going to leave a link to a free training session. I call it Plug Up the Gaps, right? Plugging up the gaps in your vendor process that can lead to fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. If you're interested, right, in taking that training session, either of them, to be honest, because I think both are needed, especially now as we're moving towards year end. If you're listening to this or to this podcast episode when it comes out on 11/13 of 2025. But these things that we're talking about putting in place, they are timeless. And actually, the question is timeless too, because fraud happens all year round. It's just increased at year end. All right, so that is it for today, everyone. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed the 364th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.